Good morning. Welcome to a mountain of waste, 70 years high, ending the nuclear age. It's my pleasure to introduce a good friend of mine. Paul Gunter has more than 35 years of experience as an anti-nuclear activist and safe energy advocate. He currently is with Beyond Nuclear in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and is the director of the Reactor Oversight Project. He was a co-founder of the New England-based Clamshell Alliance, which in 1976 opposed the construction of the Seabrook nuclear power plant in New Hampshire. I believe he's still opposing it. He is recognized international spokesperson on nuclear power and weapons issues. So you can contact him at Beyond Nuclear, and I think you all know where to find him. So Paul, I'd like to turn the panel over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Well, our work is certainly cut out for us. This morning's panel is going to talk principally about the waste. Actually, the first two panels today will talk about the waste issue. Okay. And I have the honor of introducing two very dear colleagues that I've worked with for a long time, and their expertise is indispensable on this issue. We have Diane D'Arrigo, who's the nuclear waste specialist at Nuclear Information and Resource Service in Washington, D.C. And she's a chemist by training, but a radioactive sleuth by experience. And if you've had any business to do with nuclear waste, Diane's been on your trail. And she's an excellent public advocate, policy analyst, and defender of the earth on this particular issue. So Diane will be giving us a history and an overview of the various types of nuclear waste that we're confronted with. Then we'll have our next speaker is Dr. Arjun Makhijani. Arjun is the people's scientist. He's one of the more compassionate scientists that I've ever encountered, a dear friend, and but recognized internationally on the issue of nuclear waste. Dr. Makhijani was also the recipient of the Tides Foundation Jane Bagley Lehman Award in 2008 for excellence in public advocacy. So you're in for a real treat this morning, as well as I would imagine an enlightening insight into the nuclear waste issue. So Diane.
My name is Diane D'Arrigo. I'm Radioactive Waste Project Director from Nuclear Information and Resource Service. When I was in, I think it was first grade, maybe it was second, they showed us pictures of the nuclear age, people in white suits with the glove boxes, and they were talking about the Bronze Age and the Industrial Age and the Age of Enlightenment, and then they said, and we are entering the nuclear age. And I raised my hand and I said, do we have to? And they said, we're already in it. And I said, well, can we stop it? And that was when I was a little kid and I didn't know anything. So I am thrilled that now we have a conference many years later where we're actually going to make that the goal. I mean, it has been all of our goal, but it feels especially close to my heart. I'm to talk about radioactive waste, but the reason we care about it is because it's got ionizing radiation. And ionizing radiation, as probably most of us know, but just to clarify, it is energy in the form of waves and particles that comes from either the nucleus of an unstable atom, or it can be generated from an X-ray machine. They can make X-rays without using radioactive materials. And the problem is it disrupts atoms and molecules in our bodies and in the DNA and in not just our species, but all species. Dr. Carl Z. Morgan, the father of health physics, and health physics is kind of a strange field. It's anyway, he's the one who started it. He said that there's no safe dose. There's no level of radiation so low that the risk of a malignancy is 0. Radiation causes cancer and much more. Birth defects, reduced immunity, heart disease, respiratory diseases, chromosomal damage, other health problems. Dr. Judy Johnsrud described from her trip to Chernobyl being devastated by children who had a failure to thrive. And the thing that we have ferreted out of the National Academy of Sciences papers, and that people have noticed some in their communities, is that women are more susceptible to radiation than men. If you look at the charts and the biological effects of ionizing radiation, the National Academy of Sciences report, 3 women get cancer for every 2 men. So it's a 50% greater susceptibility to fatal cancer and to cancer for women at the same doses as men. And then kids are even more susceptible, and of course baby girls are the most at risk. And I just told you all that. Well, actually the other things that Beer 7 said is that the higher the dose, the greater the risk. There's some risk even at low doses, and that fetuses have increased incidences of cancer if exposed in the womb. That's something that Alice Stewart, who was mentioned yesterday, discovered. And then there's the bystander effect, that your cells don't have to actually be hit, but neighboring cells can be hit. Progeny can be affected, the cell's progeny, by the radiation. So dodging the bullet isn't always dodging the health effect. One of the acronyms that Judy Johnsrud taught us is that radiation is MAX, multiple, additive, cumulative, and synergistic. It's worse if you're exposed to other stressors, and they don't even have to be carcinogens, but combinations of stressors sometimes make us less able to fend off the risks, the healing from damage from radiation. So, to the topic. Nuclear waste in the United States, anyway, we have it split into high-level waste, so-called low-level waste, transuranic waste. Uranium and thorium tailings don't quite make it into those categories, but they are certainly a major category, as Bob Alvarez, I think, pointed out. It's the hugest volume of radioactive waste. And then there's, I don't really know what to call it, so we're calling it out of control. It was used to be below regulatory concern. It's released, cleared, exempted radioactive waste, which they try to pretend is no longer radioactive and treat it like regular trash or sell it into recycling, which means we get exposed. And we've been pretty good at fending off in the United States these threats to deregulate waste. Different governments have authority over different categories of waste, so it gets complicated. One thing, though, is that there's an effort by the government agencies to downgrade. They want to take high-level waste, like from reprocessing, and even though it's clearly by federal definition high-level radioactive waste requiring disposal in a Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensed high-level waste repository, they want to treat it like it's not that and declare it waste incidental to reprocessing, or WIR. And then there have been efforts to, as I said, take so-called low-level waste and make it into not radioactive waste. There have been many efforts to do that, and we've been fending them off on the federal level, but internationally we're losing on this, and because of some states, particularly Tennessee, it's happening through the state level. So high-level waste is irradiated fuel from the core of nuclear reactors. It's 10 to 12 foot long, pencil-thin rods, a couple hundred per assembly, a couple hundred assemblies in the core. When it goes into the core, it's a problem, but when it comes out, it's millions of times more radioactive and can give pretty much instantaneous death, so it needs to be handled remotely. The other thing in the high-level category is the liquid and sludge from reprocessing. So we don't do commercial reprocessing in the US now. We did, and it was a mistake and a failure. We've done it for weapons. You take that irradiated fuel, chop it up, dissolve it in chemical baths, extract the uranium and plutonium for whatever, and the liquid and sludge that's left is, quote, high-level radioactive waste. Then they're hoping that they can take that liquid and sludge, or the liquid, and turn it into a solid. And that's been done at West Valley, New York, the one commercial reprocessing place in the country. We've got 275 huge glass logs, as they call them, but they're very tall, and they also give off a high amount of radioactivity. 400 to 500 rads is a lethal dose. These average 2,500 rads at the surface, and there's some that goes as high as 7,600 rads at the surface. So, and this is stuff that's going to be around for literally thousands, millions of years. And then, so that's the solid. Then irradiated fuel. Okay, so I described the irradiated fuel, and we, as of 2010, had 65,000 metric tons at the different reactors around the country, 23 billion curies, and so obviously there's more than that now, because it's 2012. The Blue Ribbon Commission, when Yucca was canceled, yay, the president was required to have a plan B, and so he set up with Secretary Chu the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. We're supposed to look at waste. They spent most of their effort looking at different new reactors that we could have, different kinds of continuing the nuclear generation of waste. But they did put some attention into the waste and came up with a proposal for consolidated interim storage. Brilliant. That means moving the fuel on the roads and rails and waterways around the country to a supposedly interim storage place or places, so that there's more room at the reactor, and so liability shifts from the utilities to the taxpayers. And this is not a new idea. We're going to be facing this in Congress as they come back in January. The consolidated storage proposal, first I knew of it was in 1979 when Congress was first making nuclear waste laws, and they were trying to get an away from reactor AFR storage provisions into the nuclear waste law, and it ended up not getting in there. Then in 1987, when the nuclear waste laws were being put forth again, MRS was the new acronym, monitored retrievable storage, but it's all the same idea. It means moving this stuff to a place that isn't designed to hold it forever, so it's as weak of a place as it would be at a reactor site, except you have the added benefit of transporting it back and forth and having taxpayers be clearly liable. So this is definitely one of our major to-dos, actions that we're going to have to do, is to fight this provision. The other thing that the BRC, the Blue Ribbon Commission, came up with was they want to make a new entity, because people don't like the Department of Energy, so they're going to make a whole new entity, or this is one of their recommendations, to have the responsibility through time of making a new nuclear dump or a permanent repository for nuclear waste. So I want to just mention that reprocessing that I described earlier is not the answer. It makes it worse. And we saw from reprocessing that took place at West Valley, New York, from 1966 to 1972, that there were high fires, high worker exposures. Cattaraugus Creek, that drains that site, was the hottest radioactive water in the country during the years of operation. And so they brought in fuel, irradiated fuel from, at the time there weren't that many commercial reactors, so 60% of it came from weapons reactors, Atomic Energy Commission waste, and commercial waste, and it was reprocessed there for 6 years. They only got through 1 year's worth of fuel, and the site was left a mess. I won't give you more on that because I don't have time, but it is projected to cost $5 billion to clean up the reprocessing part of the site, $10 billion for that whole site, which drains, as I said, to the Cattaraugus Creek, which runs through the Seneca Nation of Indians and into Lake Erie, right above where Buffalo and Erie County draw their drinking water for millions of people. And of course, Canada's just on the other side. Savannah River, Hanford, and Idaho are the three places with hundreds of tanks of high-level waste from weapons reprocessing. And the effort, of course, by Department of Energy is to make it lesser than high level, to call it waste incidental to reprocessing, grout it and leave it in place. At least at West Valley, they have taken the liquid and sludge and made it into solid, but that's a real challenge at these weapons sites. So at Oak Ridge, I understand from people who've worked there, I've never seen any written documents, that there was reprocessing done and that the high-level waste was deep well injected. So there are various ways that they're changing the definitions of waste. Rather than trying to really isolate and clean it up, the goal is to make it not as radioactive and have less requirements. So very common are called it linguistic detoxification. And transuranic waste, Bob Alvarez talked about yesterday. These are the elements that are heavier than uranium, like plutonium and americium that's in the smoke detectors. I always like to point out that our smoke detectors, the little smoke detector in your baby's bedroom has a little piece of the atom bomb in it, and there are other smoke detectors that are better at detecting household fires, but it was a deliberate effort by the Department of Energy in their byproducts utilization program to use some of the waste from reprocessing, and transuranics were extracted, and americium is only produced as a byproduct of plutonium for weapons, and is now in every home in these smoke detectors. In the 80s, there was a big effort to get these into the marketplace. DOE subsidized and undercut the cost of regular smoke detectors, and I was working in Buffalo. People here in Chicago were at that time making laws that required smoke detectors in homes, and we could not get them to ban these radioactive ones, and so it was a frustrating thing, and I have more stories about that. Getting on to low level, so-called low-level radioactive waste. So we had high level and transuranic and low level. So low level is not low risk. It can have some faintly radioactive booties and gloves from medicine and research and various places, but the thing that we care about, I wouldn't have spent my life working on this if that's all it was. The reason it matters is because it's the same radioactivity that's in the fuel rods, the same plutonium atom that's in a fuel rod and is high-level waste and leaks out of the rod into the cooling water. If it gets picked up by the filters, it becomes, quote, low-level radioactive waste. And the same for the cesiums, strontiums, and iodines. So these are, according to the Government Accounting Office, some of these can give a lethal dose in 20 minutes unshielded. So you can't really call it just low level, low risk. It's important to deal with this as a radioactive waste. The government has it split into classes A, B, C, and greater than C, with A the least concentrated, but plutonium can be in class A. So A is not to be sneezed at. A, B, C, greater than C are increasing concentrations. And that's for commercial nuclear waste. And the Department of Energy uses risk-based categories. They assume that they're going to know what they're going to do with the waste in the long term, like if it's buried somewhere, or they project using Argonne-created computer codes to determine what the dose would be to people down the future, and then that's how they back calculate, supposedly, the categorization, the risk of the waste. The problem with it is that it's not enforceable, it's not verifiable, and the ABC category is pretty bad, but this is also pretty bad, and so that's a problem. The Department of Energy has enormous amounts of radioactive materials on its weapons sites. In the year 2000, they made a ban, a suspension, and a moratorium on allowing any metal from the radioactive areas of the Department of Energy complex to go into commercial recycling. The metal industry, the environmental community, landfill people, workers, all pushed to prevent DOE from deregulating waste at that time. We had a success. Now, Secretary Chu has signed an order to reverse those and allow for the managers of the different sites to make a determination whether or not it needs to be kept out of recycling or sent into recycling. So our action is to make these bans permanent. Our action request for the group. Commercial nuclear waste, let's see. Yeah, it's not irradiated fuel, it's not reprocessing high-level waste. Mill tailings and mine tailings were kept out of the category just because the law was passed at a time when that wasn't being addressed. That law, the mill tailings got addressed later in '78. And it's not transuranic, which is the stuff that's heavier than uranium, above 100 nanocuries per gram. So there can be there is transuranic waste in the low-level category. It is just limited to 100 nanocuries per gram, as if they really can measure it. So the things that are low-level waste, that, and then in Canada this would be low and intermediate level waste, irradiated components from the core of from all throughout the reactor hardware, control rods from the core of reactors. They stop the neutrons to stop the chain reaction that several speakers have described. The resins, filters, sludges, evaporator bottoms, these are the things that clean the cooling water that circulate around the core. So when the high-level waste leaks out of the rods into the water, if it gets filtered, then it's so-called low level. And if the filters miss it, then it's a routine legal release. And entire reactors themselves become waste, although more and more as reactors and weapons complex sites are being cleaned up, they're trying to treat as much as possible as regular garbage. But there are tons of contaminated concrete and steel that result. Just to make a point that medical waste is often used as a foot in the door for weakened radioactive regulations to promote new dumps, and it's actually in medical treatment and diagnosis. They use very, very small amounts. They use short-lasting elements. They don't use iodine-129 with the 16 million year half-life. They use iodine-131 with an 8-day half-life or even shorter. And the most common isotope is technetium-99m with a 6-hour half-life. So medical waste, if you come up against that in any fights that you have, we've got a few reports that we did along with Physicians for Social Responsibility back a while ago, but we can provide you with some help with fighting that. The history is that there were 6 commercial so-called low-level radioactive waste dumps in the country, and all of them have or are leaking. And then there have been 2 that have opened since 1980 law that told every state to take responsibility for making dumps for the nuclear industry. So the one in Clive, Utah, run by Energy Solutions, it only takes the less concentrated, the Class A waste, but there have been many efforts to try to blend the A, B, and C together so that it could get in there as a place to go. And the saddest thing, we should probably have a moment of silence in honor of the people that have fought the waste control specialist dump in Andrews, Texas, but that dump did take its first commercial low-level radioactive waste and put it in the ground near the Ogallala Aquifer on April 27th of this year, 2012, and it's the first dump that they got open since 1980 for low-level so-called waste. And the rest of the country, all the reactor operators have then, and all of the processors have jumped in and done applications to join in and dump in that compact, even though it's only supposed to be for Vermont and Texas. This is the old technique of kick and roll, the trucks back up and dump it into the trenches. So the dumps that exist have, well, as I said, they are leaking or have leaked, and this is why. The Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act passed in 1980 and amendments in 85, and what it did was require states to take responsibility and provide disposal for commercial nuclear power, commercial nuclear waste, and make disposal for it. And if they didn't, they had to take title to it. And so I thought that was pretty outrageous in my 20s when I first was reading about this and working on it, and thought that seems wrong. And so in New York, we were able to get New York to challenge the law, and it was overturned by the Supreme Court. And so states don't have to take title, but the steamroller was already rolling, and states were doing the bidding to get these dumps in place. And it made it so hard for people. They were fighting not only the nuclear industry, but their local government and their state government, and so it's, you know, an uphill battle all the way, but it was successful. No new dumps opened, as I said, until this year. And what happened when there was a limited amount or no access to dumps, that was one of the things the law did, was it limited access to the existing dumps to states that were making progress in getting new dumps in place. There were a lot of incentives. So this industry of processors in Tennessee that burn and smelt and shred and compact and do all kinds of things to nuclear waste, they really started to take the waste that would have gone straight to disposal to them. So it goes into Tennessee. 2/3, 3/4 of the so-called low-level waste in the country goes via Tennessee to a dump, and Tennessee set up a provision to allow for the companies, the processing companies, to make the decision of whether this could go into regular garbage dumps in the state. So they would make money by having the generators pay to manage low-level waste, and then they would cheaply manage it by sending it to regular garbage, and also doing these other things to it, these processing activities, which continue today. And there's also a new company like this in Ohio. There are other processors. Pennsylvania has Aileron. There are a few others. So some of the processors are Energy Solutions, studsevic, Impact. They actually opened an incinerator a few years ago and have already gone bankrupt and left millions of dollars of waste sitting in the middle of Tennessee that the state is managing. Toxco, Permafix, Aerojet, they burn depleted uranium at Aerojet. And that, is the worst thing you can do is inhale. And these are processors that incinerate. Some of these incinerate. Phylotechnics, Nuclear Fuel Services. These are the companies, studsevic, Energy Solutions, Impact, Toxco, and Phylotechnics, that were able to send to regular garbage dumps in 5 different dumps, regular trash landfills, some of them leaking already. There have been 5 to 7 incinerators in Tennessee. It's the worst thing you can do. And then in the Bruce Peninsula in Canada, there's an incinerator. And the Department of Energy did run an incinerator. I think the point about nuclear incineration is it can be stopped. Anytime people knew there was a nuclear incinerator coming, they have stopped it. It's only when they snuck in to add to the secrecy that was mentioned yesterday. There are a lot of different ways to pretend this stuff isn't radioactive, different things to call it, and so we've got a report on our website, and I've got some here out of control on purpose, and I was listing all the different ways that the government and the nuclear industry, these are names for what you do with waste to not have to regulate it. We've had some talking about mines and mill waste, not enough, but major points are that it's abandoned in piles all over areas where people live and work. Very long-lasting dangers. The uranium and its decay chain, it gets actually more radioactive over time. There are weaker standards for what happens with tailings and than what happens for low-level waste, and that's pretty bad. And there hasn't been even an effort, really, a big effort to clean up the big mess from the first round of nuclear, and now to come back and start new mining is unconscionable and in violation of the Native American bans on it, on their land. Arjun, I'll bet you, might talk a little about depleted uranium within the category of low-level waste. My upshot on it is that depleted uranium was never considered when they were defining and doing their environmental impact statements for so-called low-level waste. Depleted uranium was never even analyzed. And the waste gets more radioactive over time, and the dumps are only licensed for 100, they're licensed for about 30 years with 100 years of institutional control. So putting depleted uranium into an unlined soil trench that's only going to be monitored for 100 years is pretty bad. We have before us now the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, at the behest of the industry, considering changing the whole regulatory scheme and the laws and rules for radioactive waste, because the industry at one point wasn't real happy with it. Now that they've got their waste control specialist dump in Texas opened, they may back off on that pressure, but there is change underway at the NRC, and they're really not interested in what the public wants, and their goal is not isolation of the waste. So my action steps for us are, I was talking about high-level waste at the beginning, we're going to need to fight the consolidated storage. And I've got a couple of letters here that have gone to Congress and others that I'll put out on the back table. I'm sure you're going to write down all those names real quick. Those are the contacts. And, oh, yeah, I don't have time. Bonus action is EPA is about to weaken the protective action guides across the country, kind of like Japan did, even though we're not having a Fukushima right now. And so we're going to, by the end of the year, probably have to fight that. Thanks, and I'll move on to Arjun.
Thank you, Diane. And so, okay, now we'll hear from Dr. Arjun Makajani with the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research.
Thank you, Paul. As a Hindu, I can give you a little insight into how waste is classified.
He's echoing.
So waste it's really not a classification system that we have for waste. It's a caste system. Because it's not according to its risk and danger that you got from Diane's presentation. It's really how it was born. So that's how a caste system is defined. You're not defined by who you are, but to whom you were born. So we have this thing, uranium mill tailings come from uranium milling, and uranium mine waste come. By the way, we've talked about mill tailing waste, but mine wastes are pretty much unregulated. And there are more than 200 million tons of mine waste. And there are more than 200 million tons of mill waste. Mill waste at least were moved into lined tailings ponds. Now, how long that plastic will last, we don't know. So that was part of the treatment, was to move from unlined ponds, which were seeping water pollution, radium, and so on, into the groundwater and emitting radon into the air, to move them into lined ponds at great expense. But the bad news is that the sort of principal radioactive element of concern in these mill tailings is radium-226. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years, and the tailings ponds are supposed to last for 1,000 years, the linings. They're supposed to, although in some cases, they already were torn up while they were being installed, and there's these little critters that live underground. But the bad news is that radium doesn't exist by itself. It really is what they call a daughter product, the gender politics of the nuclear. It's a daughter product of thorium-230, and thorium-230 exists in about the same radioactivity quantity, and that has a half-life of 75,000 years, so 3 times the half-life of plutonium. So mill tailings are essentially forever, and they're lying around in more than 200 million tons, mostly in the Colorado Plateau, but also in other places in the country, and mine waste, as you heard yesterday. It's the biggest volume headache with very long-lived radionuclides in them. And we haven't yet properly come to grips with the classification of this because we're not paying enough attention. And I have to agree with yesterday's 2 Native American speakers said that we are not paying, we have not had enough solidarity in practice with dealing with this particular problem. And I think if we're going to end the nuclear age, we can't forget about these wastes. So we have mill tailings, and then we have, I'm going to come to spent fuel, which has the most radioactivity, and then transuranic waste you already heard about. So I want to focus a little bit on what's happening with low-level waste first, before I go on to, will you give me a 10, 12 minutes, and then I'll talk about high-level waste for the last 10 minutes. Low-level waste, you've got a pretty good introduction in terms of its danger, that can be very dangerous, can be very dilute, can be short-lived, can be long-lived. I want to tell you a little bit about how it is regulated and what is currently happening. So it's regulated under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's regulations, 10 CFR 61. That's where you'll find the regulations. And in subpart C, and really we need to pay attention to the fine print if we're going to win this fight. In subpart C, it defines what is the maximum radiation dose that you can get from a low-level nuclear waste disposal facility, as they call it. Notice the number of euphemisms that there are. low-level nuclear waste disposal facility. Everything is very easy. That's why it's called a facility. If you dump it, it's pretty easy. If you manage it properly, it gets harder. The allowable radiation dose is defined as 25 millirem to the whole body. So you're going to have to bear with me on the numbers. 25 millirem to the whole body, or to any organ of the body in 1 year. Or for the thyroid, 75 millirem. That's the maximum allowable dose. And the most important phrase is to any member of the public. Now, who is a member of the public? It turns out that in practice, the way a member of the public is defined, it is to be found in the International Commission on Radiological Protection publication in 1975, I think ICRP 23, although I don't remember exactly. As a 20 to 30-year-old Caucasian male, this is almost an exact quote, of a certain height and 154 pounds, 70 kilograms, and of European and North American cultural and dietary habits. Something pretty close to that. So for 6 years, we have been having this debate with the EPA, who also has a similar rule at 40 CFR 190, which regulates the whole nuclear fuel cycle, about who is a member of the public. And I have said, that if any member of the public is to be exposed to this maximum dose, then we should be enforcing compliance according to whoever it is, whether it's an old person, a young person, a man, a woman, an infant, or a 20 to 30-year-old Caucasian male. And which in some cases may be the most exposed, because Caucasian males, if they're vigorously active, they may eat and drink a lot more. And so for the same contamination, they may get a bigger dose with some radionuclides. It actually happens sometimes. But not necessarily a bigger risk, because for the same dose, of course, children have bigger risk. At one point, I got so frustrated with this debate with the EPA, trying to convince them to enforce. So nothing needs to change. All they need to do is to say, from now on, we're going to regard children and women as members of the public. Blacks and whites, Native Americans, all right. And so at one point, I realized that I hadn't asked the right question. So in my frustration, in an on-the-record conversation, I said, do you agree that children are members of the public? And there was this long pause. And then they said, we don't disagree with that. So this is one big fight, is in the disposal and treatment of waste. We need to get children and women this is where we are in the nuclear establishment, people. The other thing with this revision that the industry wants, the way it came about is the low-level waste rule was defined in around 1980. And they defined maximum concentrations of certain radionuclides. And they actually, slight correction, they actually in the draft EIS, which we got from you, Diane, and we still have the copy, which we're keeping for you, they analyzed depleted uranium, and they set a maximum concentration for it, far from pure depleted uranium. You couldn't dispose off pure. And then when it came to finalizing the rule, they said, well, we're never going to dispose off pure depleted uranium because maybe we might use it in breeder reactors, to make plutonium. This is the dream. We have 500,000 tons of depleted uranium in metal terms, which you could run 1,000 reactors for 500 years with that much if you turned it into plutonium. It's, it's a gold mine. And I say that sarcastically, because you have to invest more gold in it than you can get out. It's not a gold-producing machine in money terms. But then it became evident that there's nothing to do with this. Breeder reactor programs have failed after $100 billion of expenditures worldwide, trying to commercialize them. And so the NRC declared that operationally we're going to treat this as a waste in licensing enrichment plants. So this is where we worked with NIRS at great length to try to get this defined properly so that depleted uranium would be disposed of in deep disposal because it is in all essential characteristics like transuranic waste, which you heard about yesterday. It has the same radiological characteristics. It's more than 100 nanocuries per gram. It goes to the bone. It hurts you if you inhale it, et cetera, except that it gets more radioactive over time, except plutonium waste generally gets sort of less radioactive over time. Now, the NRC acknowledged that depleted uranium from enrichment plants in these large quantities wasn't regulated under the old rule. The other thing that's a problem in the old rule is it doesn't define the maximum amount of radioactivity that you can dump in a low-level waste disposal facility. Only regulates concentrations. So you've got this whole movement to dilute all this stuff, and then you have an indefinitely large amount of radioactivity that could be put in shallow land burial. Then, so they want to put depleted uranium in shallow land burial, and we argued at length that they shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't make any technical sense. Our institute was the only one during the licensing of that New Mexico facility to actually do calculations that showed all the norms of radiation protection would be violated, not by 2 times, not by 5 times, not by 10 times, but by hundreds of times, that 25 millirem rule. And that using the computer programs that are made here in Argonne. So we are in dialogue with Argonne. I've sent 2 of my people for training to Argonne so we could understand what's in the guts of this thing, which includes reference man. They at least acknowledge that children exist and put children dose conversion factors at our insistence. So I have to salute Argonne National Lab for being ahead of the rest of the nuclear establishment, for that at least. Now, so we're in this argument, and the cost difference is very great between deep disposal, like waste isolation pilot plant, and shallow disposal. So somehow they accepted that it would be in shallow disposal, and you know, we have this immigrant's observation of how the US government works is it's the economic side. It's an economic machine to turn public assets into private profits and to turn private liabilities into public liabilities. And nowhere is that more evident than the nuclear business. And part of this is there's a law that says that the DOE shall take charge of depleted uranium at some agreed upon price. And we were not actually allowed to examine the details of how this price was agreed upon between the company that built the enrichment plant and the Department of Energy, and the whole thing was kind of papered over, and the last minute said, we're not going to do commercial disposal. The DOE will just take it and we'll agree upon a price and then we'll see. So that's how that plant was licensed. But that argument is still going on because depleted uranium has not yet been properly classified under the rule. So we pushed very hard on it. And really, I have to salute our partnership with NIRS because NIRS has been very, very much in the leadership of this. It's been wonderful to work with them. And finally, the NRC acknowledged that we need to classify this stuff properly. And so the initial proposal was to kind of do this bizarre calculation that if you dump it in shallow land burial, you can do a 1,000,000-year calculation, and you assume there'll be no erosion, and everything will be stable for 1,000,000 years. Under that sensibility, under that set of assumptions, you could put spent fuel under your tennis court, which has been proposed. No, not seriously. But people have said, you know, you could dig a hole under the tennis court, and spent fuel is so small in volume that we'll put it under somebody's tennis court. And I said, not my tennis court. And so now we're at the place where we've got these bizarre calculations where the NRC has said, it's okay because even after 1,000,000 years, people will not be overexposed by this really very strange calculation. Because there'll be no real erosion, the cap will be stable, radon will really not escape in material quantities, and so on and so on. Okay, there'll be dry area, so it won't infiltrate down into the groundwater in large quantities, and so on. I have protested this numbers of times. I also protested the official calculations in Utah. I'll give you an insight into some of the technical things that go on. Some of the technical work of the establishment is good. Sometimes you find really bizarre things. So in challenging depleted uranium disposal and the dump in Utah, which has been licensed with a technical analysis, I found that part of that technical analysis said that you could dispose of more uranium. So they calculate how many curies per gram, which is a 30th of an ounce. So I noticed a very strange number, a very large number of curies per gram, and I calculated the amount of uranium-238 they were officially allowed to dispose off under certain scenarios would be greater than the weight of the Earth. So I thought, you know, weight of the Earth, more than 1/30th of a gram. So I officially said, under oath, I testified that this was an absurd, unscientific document, in some cases at least, even though the NRC testified that it was a scientifically sound document. For 6 years, I have been trying to get the state of Utah and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to fix this document. And they have not yet done it, although they have never refuted my calculations. Recently protested to the new chairman of the NRC, and I sent her a letter about that, saying, you need to make sure that the science under your watch is better than what is going on. So let me kind of step back from these details and tell you where I am about nuclear waste. So most of this waste really should not be, that contains large amounts of radioactivity, even if it's classified as B or C waste. If it's long-lived and is large amounts of curies, we shouldn't be disposing it off in shallow burial. So for example, the graphite from the Manhattan Project, which is radioactive in those reactors, the DOE proposes to put it on the plateau above the Columbia River in Washington. By their own calculations, the water would be contaminated at hundreds of times the drinking water limit, hundreds and hundreds of years into the future. And this is the official plan. And I'm saying it doesn't matter if it looks like Class C waste. You can't dump this on the, few miles from the Columbia River. This is absurd. Why waste? So deep disposal, unfortunately, there's no good answer. That's why all of us say we need to stop making this stuff. But then I also have occasionally parted company with some people who say it's the nuclear industry's problem. They created it. They should manage it. The nuclear industry, an example of the responsibility of the nuclear industry was that in a public meeting got together by Hazel O'Leary, a utility executive said about high-level waste, take this stuff from our site, spent fuel, and I don't care where you put it. So I personally don't think that we can leave this to the responsibility of the nuclear industry, so that we've always proposed that certain kinds of waste should go into deep disposal, including spent fuel. Let me spend a little time going over what the French are doing and show you where all the pieces of spent fuel and reprocessing go. Are my slides up? So this is what is in spent fuel. See this trace isotopes of uranium. Uranium-235 is a fissile material. Uranium-236 is a nuisance uranium isotope that gets created in the reactor. Uranium-238 is most of it. Uranium-238 is basically depleted uranium, but this is spent fuel. 93% of spent fuel. You don't need the uranium-238 from spent fuel, because we already have 500,000 tons of it sitting around, separated, that we don't know what to do with. So you don't need that. Plutonium is about 1%. Fission products about 4%, and then neptunium and so on, about 0.1%. This is spent fuel. So what does the French do? So this is a Sankey diagram. So if you have 1 kilogram of fuel, you need about 7.5 kilograms of natural uranium. Now remember, those people from the nuclear business who tell you there's very little nuclear waste. They're not talking about all of this part that comes before. For every kilogram of natural uranium you need, typically 1% ore, you have 100 kilograms of ore, sometimes 0.1%. So you might have 100 kilograms for every of those 7.5 kilograms. So now you're talking 7.5 tons for every kilo of ore for every kilogram of fuel. 1,000 kilograms in a ton, 7,500. So once you enrich the fuel, most of that, 6,440, goes away to depleted uranium, which we know now is practically a waste. 1 kilogram is fuel. You know, almost none of the matter gets converted into energy. Very small. E equal MC squared gives you a lot of energy with very little matter. So you get about 1 ton of spent fuel back, almost. You reprocess it, the fission products go to waste. You have 10 grams of plutonium, 1%, and you fabricate it into fuel, and you have 124 grams of fuel, but most of that fuel comes back out as spent fuel, which is unusable. So now you've got mixed oxide spent fuel, which is hotter, more dangerous, and more difficult to dispose of, and the French don't know what to do with it. It's simply piling up. So this is the La Hague factory. Then you reprocess, and as I told you yesterday, they've polluted the seas all the way to the Arctic. 11 of the European Union countries have said, please stop. Please. Doesn't work. Didn't work. It's voluntary compliance. They don't have to. So if you look at this diagram very carefully, after one round of enrichment and reprocessing and re-enrichment, out of 7,440 grams, 7,197 grams is waste. And at the other end, what comes out is also mostly waste. We're using almost none of the resource. Breeder reactors are dead that could help use more of the resource. And basically what we're doing is we're creating larger and larger volumes of waste out of the same amount of radioactivity because we're dumping it into the English Channel. Now we got vitrified waste. So let me show you how that works. So this is volumes of waste. So if you do once through, you have 70,000 tons. If you do reprocessing, you have less high-level waste, but then you have greater than Class C waste, which has to go out to a repository. So total repository waste has now multiplied by 6 times. The low-level waste has also multiplied. The transports have multiplied by 6, 7 times. And this is called a solution to the problem of radioactive waste. So same amount of radioactivity, you haven't done with it. Now you got mock spent fuel, which is much more dangerous. So people who say, now I've said these same things in front of the CEO of the company that does this stuff a few years ago. She did not challenge the numbers. They all come from the annual reports of this company. Fortunately, as I told you, I married a French woman, and she refused to speak English when I met her, so I know French. So I can read and speak it, and I've done this discourse in France in French. We've looked at the French repository program. The French have done this about as well as it can be done. You have to hand that to them. But it's still a mess. We don't want to go there. Besides the proliferation problems and so on and so on. So my bottom line from this is really deep geologic, we can't leave this stuff, the worst case from leaving it on site. You could have terrorist attacks, as Bob has shown, Bob Alvarez in an analysis, the amount of cesium that you have in spent fuel in Fukushima or at Indian Point is so much vaster than what was at Chernobyl that it would be a major disaster. We don't want this stuff to be sitting around indefinitely. So we want hardened on-site storage, but it's not a long-term, there's no long-term answer. The industry isn't going to do it, so let's stop the production, let's get out of nuclear, but then we need a sound, in my opinion, we need a sound repository program. We've said what it should look like, interim management, what's an isolation system. It's very complicated, it's very difficult, but I believe necessary. So the treatment part of it is a bad thing overall, because when you're treating this stuff, you're breaking it apart, you're adding chemicals, you're increasing the volume, you're creating liquid waste, you're creating different streams of solid waste. You really don't want to do that. You want to leave the plutonium in the spent fuel. It's too radioactive to steal. And then you want to stop producing more. You want to get out of the nuclear renaissance. And really, we're out of it. The good news, I think, for this conference, in my personal judgment, is I believe we are exiting from the nuclear age, even though the nuclear people are kicking and screaming. For two reasons. It's very expensive, and these large power plants are incompatible with where we're headed with the electricity and energy system. What the Germans are doing, which you'll hear this afternoon, is nuclear power is technically incompatible with, large plants at least, with what we need going forward in the electricity system. So we need to be more firm about what should be done. I'm going to wrap up. 2 messages. We really need to get children and women into the regulatory framework. It's a very big and very important struggle. It's a vulnerable point of the nuclear establishment. We need to stop making the waste, and we need to be upfront with the system about where it should go. Oh, a secret. 1983 National Academy study has a little chart without a map, and if you do a little calculation about where it actually is, it's pretty close to the White House, the good repository site.
Thank you, Arjun. Okay, so we're going to take a little extra time from the break for questions and answers, okay?
Sorry.
Diane, very good description of our waste disposal in this country. Can you say a few words about the problems of waste disposal in other countries around the world and what we may be facing in third world countries such as Pakistan, India, et cetera?
I actually haven't, there's been a proposal for a repository in India in the south, in an old gold mine, actually, Kolar Goldfields, but I don't know what the status of it is, and I haven't followed it. Yeah, I have not followed the discussion in India. Pakistan doesn't have a commercial nuclear power program to speak of, and so their wastes are probably largely in the uranium. I'm sure their wastes are in the uranium mining and milling and processing business. They don't have a big plutonium production complex. They have a small one in the weapons program, but I'm not familiar with their waste program. I know that India has a reprocessing plant in what used to be the outskirts of Bombay, which is now in the middle of a huge industrial area storing liquid high-level wastes. So pretty risky, but I'm not following very closely. I know more about Europe, actually, from having participated in the French discussions and the repository program. They're having, the French are like everybody else. They don't want this stuff in their backyard. There's been a very, very fierce debate, but I have to say their repository program has been better than ours.
Let me give 2 other countries' answer. One is Canada's plan is to bury it under Lake Huron at the Bruce Peninsula. And in Japan, I never was really able to figure out, maybe people from Japan can help, but even though I went to Japan, I wasn't able to really figure out what they were doing with their so-called low-level waste. I was shown at Rokoshimoro, which is where their reprocessing facility is, an area that was already flooded. It was on the coast, and the ocean was washing over the area, and they said, that's where we're going to put our low-level waste. We're going to bury it there below the water. And I thought I was having an interpretation problem with the language. Anyway, we should.
One other point, the Swedes and the French do have a classification system that's a little better than ours. They have intermediate level waste, which is some of our Class B waste and Class C waste and greater than Class C waste. They do put that in deep disposal. The Swedes have an intermediate waste disposal repository in operation, sort of like WIP. And the French are planning to do that as well. So it's not like what I'm advocating is technically, unknown or out there, or especially coming from a point of view that says stop making more.
Okay, so we're going to take 11 minutes more of questions and comments, so please keep your questions short and our answers shorter.
Okay, it's so complex. I was wondering if each of you could mention what actions you think we should be pushing for to have the most effect for these problems in the United States.
Well, we have this, not quite a campaign, but I hope from next year on, a campaign to get children and women onto the regulatory compliance landscape. We kind of held off for a number of years for a variety of reasons. But I do intend to push on this next year, so we will be in touch about writing to the EPA and the NRC. I already wrote to Dr. McFarland at the NRC about it. I think the stopping more production of waste is very, very important. And so I think we're already engaged in the right, and that's the right focus for now. The repository part will take a long time. We ought to fight the consolidated storage, so I'd urge you to sign Diane's
my
letter.
2 action steps were to stop the consolidated storage and to stop deliberately putting radioactive materials into everyday household items. And of course, we'll be working with Arjun. I'll put these in the back. I was going to hand them out from the front, but radiation is 50% more harmful to women, and we can make some hay with this.
This is for Arjun. We're caught in this double bind to take it off site because of the impasse between the lawsuits and the situation now. And you had the beginning of an idea about buying the land on site. If you could talk about that, I think it'll give us something to go home with, at least to answer this impasse.
So during the Blue Ribbon Commission process, the Blue Ribbon Commission brought up this very important problem that in addition to ratepayer money going to the utilities and the federal government, taxpayer money is now going to pay the fines because the federal government abrogated its contracts to take away spent fuel from the site starting in 1998. And a large part of the Blue Ribbon Commission's focus was how to stop that hemorrhaging of taxpayer money and stop paying the fines. And some of the impetus for this consolidated storage came from there. And I recognize, it's a legitimate goal to stop that hemorrhaging of taxpayer money to pay fines to nuclear utilities. And I suggested to Per Peterson, one of the members of the commission, in a private conversation, that one way to address this issue would be for the federal government to buy land at some of the nuclear power plant sites that had a fair amount of land and establish hardened on-site storage at those sites, which would then be federal sites. We would no longer be paying those fines, and we would be able to develop hardened on-site storage. I didn't get very far with that. It didn't wind up in the report, but I still think it's a reasonable and sensible proposal. It would get us some way toward hardened on-site storage and emptying out those pools and so on. But I haven't found any takers yet. But that's my suggestion for on-site storage for the long term and kind of meeting the utilities halfway. They won't like it necessarily, but I think it can be done.
I have 2 questions, one for Deb, and that is, can you talk about some of the problems with the deep injection wells? Because fracking also is retrieving, half of the wastewater for fracking is radioactive as well, and they're injecting it into the deep injection wells. Can you talk a little bit about that problem, the leaching of radiation from the deep injection wells? If that's possible. And then Arjun, could you tell us where, if you were the king of the world, where would you put this stuff? Where is the repository? Okay, thanks.
I don't know a whole lot about. I'm not an expert on fracking or on deep well injection. It's just that if you deliberately inject it down into the groundwater, it can't be a good thing. The NRC, I remember when they were first licensing the in situ leachate uranium mining, were offering workshops to the people who had to do the calculations, both the NRC who would regulate it and the companies, and they were showing how using a regular laptop you could do the calculations to show that your amount of injection material would be legal. And so it's, you know, I can't give you a technical description on that, but, and I, to answer the question you gave Arjun, don't think any of us are in a position to offer a sacrifice area. I don't think that that's something that we have the authority, the divine authority to do.
Yeah. Let me, you know, I can't imagine myself being king of the world, but I have, wouldn't want to be. But I have proposed how we should go about this. See, the mistake is to think that it's about a site. It's not about a site. It's about three different things, because you can find natural geologies in which radiological materials that occur naturally haven't migrated very far naturally for millions of years. That you can show with current geological knowledge. But that's not what a repository is. The spent fuel doesn't magically wind up underground. It's not very dilute like natural radioactive material. So you're making a giant mine. So if you have a good repository, you still have to make a mine. You're putting very hot spent fuel in there, so you're changing the thermal and hydrological characteristics. So now, and then you got to fill it back up, so you got a lot of new joints and cracks that are artificially created, and you got to seal it back up. So now you got to show not only that the geology was right, which you can actually show, or wrong, but now you got to show that these artificial seals are going to work, and that you're going to have something resembling the old geology that was there with the most important components being artificial. That's hard to do. So what I've proposed to the Blue Ribbon Commission, and my slides are up on our website, and they are also on the Blue Ribbon Commission website, is that we should take a break from this obsession with siting for 10 years. Although I've told you what the National Academy said, you know, 1983, and where might be a suitable site, I don't agree with that reasoning. I think we should study sites, geologies, container materials and engineered barriers, and sealing systems all together, because they need to work together. And we need to figure out how we're going to model these things together, and which sets, which combinations might work without getting into a siting process. So if we did this for 10 years in a transparent scientific way and got politics out of it, by these criteria, Yucca Mountain is a completely hopeless site. In my opinion, the worst site that was investigated in the United States. That's why I opposed it. We need to take a break from whose backyard we're going to put it in, just because it reflects the attitude of the utilities. Take it away from us, and I don't care where you put it. Now we got this pressure of billions of dollars of fines that we're paying the utilities out of the taxpayer's pocket. I think the best way to get a repository would be to take a 10-year break and do some science. And then I think the public, you can go to the public with something serious to discuss, not what we had in the 1980s in terms of a hopeless technical debate in which the DOE had what I call an ignorance is bliss model. When they didn't know something about the geology, they would give it a perfect score for that characteristic.
Okay, we're only going to have an opportunity for a couple more questions and comments if we keep them short. We have to take a break.
Okay, Brene Lloyd from Northwatch, Northern Ontario, and a very quick comment. And I would agree, Arjun, that we should take a break from citing, but I think we also need to take a break from endorsing geological repositories. In Canada, in 1977, 3 men, 3 months decided geological repositories in the Canadian Shield was it. And the industry and the federal government haven't really strayed from that in the last several decades. But in our experience, every time a geological repository, whether it's a generic concept or an actual proposal, is brought forward, under investigation, under examination, it begins to fall apart. Certainly that's what happened with the ACL siting process in the 80s. It's what happened with the generic concept in Canada, that review in the 1990s. It's what happened with Yucca Mountain. And it's what's starting to happen with the Swedish review now. Their application was put in a year ago. It's been returned. Deficiencies with the container, the engineered barrier, deficiencies with the performance modeling, with the safety case. So I think, you know, I live on the rock that many people who are critics of Yucca Mountain think is a really good rock. We kind of like it without that repository, without that kind of imposition, and we now have 21 communities who are being studied as repository sites, and the industry and the feds will smooth over all the nuances that I know are there, Arjun, in your underlying analysis. So I think we need to be very, very careful about that, and I think that we need to say that there are a huge number of scientific uncertainties, and glossing those over lets the industry continue to say the waste will go away. And it lets the waste, in the Canadian context, it means the waste stays in the pools.
So you know, this is a very complicated issue, obviously. But here's my thinking. What is the worst case, so part of my thinking, what is the worst case outcome of putting it in a deep geologic repository, and the worst case outcome of leaving it at all these sites where it is? And I think they're completely non-comparable. The worst case outcome of leaving it where it is incredibly catastrophic. Whereas even if you look at some of the more extreme Yucca Mountain calculations in a really bad site, they are bad. So that's why we say we should stop making this stuff. So we need to make that a parallel fight. We need to get the industry to be not in charge. So what is wrong with the process, and in the Canadian process as much as in the US process or in the French process, is you gravitate towards selecting the sites before you've done the scientific homework. That has happened throughout the world. That's why I advocate this pause. I don't know what the answer is going to be 10 years from now. That's why I don't say the repository is a solution. I always say it's the least bad thing, because if you have a release of a significant part of the cesium from Indian Point or Vermont Yankee, I think there is no repository location that I have seen any calculation that would produce an outcome. Now, is it bad? I would agree it is bad. I think we need to have a process in which the industry is not in control, which means we're really on our way out of nuclear power. But I cannot in good conscience say that we should stop thinking that we need to put this in a repository and leave it to the industry, because what we're going to wind up is the stuff will go to Savannah River, in this country at least, and we're going to get reprocessing. And a lot more public money, a lot more waste, because we're not in control of this stuff. We don't control the spent fuel. We don't control the political process. We need to exercise the maximum leverage to get done what we can. We prevailed on Yucca Mountain. We need to go the next step and get this 10-year exploration.
Okay.
That's the best I can give you. Not a very good, but.
I would just say that if we can't stop making it, then any repository or illusion of a repository is going to be considered the answer and justify more making it. So most of us have said we're not going to help find somewhere to put it until you stop making it, and that's one of the approaches. I mean, I realize in the long run that it's not safe where it is. It's not safe where it is now. So that's why we need to stop making it.
Okay, I want to thank our speakers.